Hello again. There are two key factors that directly impact employee engagement. Those factors are trust and truth. Poor leaders want their people to trust them, of course, but they tend to not want to have to trust their people in return. Poor leaders want to hear the truth all of the time, but they don't tend to want to have to tell it all of the time. Look, when trust is absent or eroded within an organization, what do you imagine the consequences might be? Well, we see disengagement, we see conflict, we see a drop in employee engagement. Of course, we see a drop in organizational performance, all to be avoided, I'm sure you'll agree. So today we're going to clear up exactly what trust and truth means for leaders, and here's the key. As you can imagine, it all starts with you. I'm Antonio, and today I'm going to be your leadership coach. So let's you and me spend the next 30-45 minutes together, and let's explore some practical strategies to build trust and embrace truth in your leadership and in your organization. Remember, we want to future-proof ourselves, our people, and our business, and that starts with trust and truth. And this way you can start finally to begin to stop managing and start leading. Let's start with a question, something to think about, and do think about it, right? What's the very best way to get a referral? Hold the phone, you think. What's referrals got to do with anything, Antonio? Well, just bear with me for a second. When we're training sales teams, we ask them, what's the best way to get a referral? We often then hear, well, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, we've got to build value, we've got to show that we're meaning it, we've got a relationship over time, and on and on and on and on. You know, the very best way to get a referral is to give one, right? If you want more referrals, give more referrals, right? That's, when you think about it that way, it's fairly self-evident. Okay, so what's your best strategy for the truth then? Well, why don't we start by telling it? Maybe our strategy for truth should start with always tell the truth. We'll come back to that in a minute. Well, let me ask you this then. And do take this seriously. What percentage of the time do you think that your people tell you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I'll ask again. What percentage of the time do you think that your people are telling you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Well, let's agree that it's not 100%. Now, neither should we expect it to be. Neither is it 0%. It's somewhere between 0 and 100, okay. Typically what people tell us in terms of the percentage of the truth is they kind of tell us what they think it's in their best interest to have us believe. So it's south of 100. Let's just be generous and say 80%. Let's say that our people on average are telling us 80% of the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And we might say, well, 80%, it's close, it's no cigar, but it's good enough. Well, Jim Collins in Good to Great said, good enough is not good enough. I think a lot could be achieved if we could manage to figure out how to go from 80% to 85%. I bet that 5% has magic and power and stuff that really can help propel the business forward. If we could figure out how to go from trust and truth from 80% to 85%, then good things would happen. Okay, so we know we're not getting 100% of the truth. We know we're getting some version of the truth that they think it's in their best interest to have you believe. Let's figure it out. Let's figure out, how do we increase truth? How do we increase trust? How would they then propel us forward? I also want to introduce you to a couple of models today. We're going to start by looking back at the leadership honeycomb that we've talked about in the past. So I have here a model that I drew for an earlier episode. Let's have a look at it, and then I'm going to tell you where you can get a much cleaner, much better, a much more professional model, and where to get it, and then we'll take it from there. So take a second and have a look at this model that I drew in the past. Okay, so from an earlier episode, I drew this model, right? We call this the leadership honeycomb model. And we say, look, leadership is very interconnected, right? There are lots of things that are happening in terms of good leadership. For good leadership to happen, lots of things need to be all kind of meshing and, contributing well to each other. That means, by dint of the reverse, that if leadership isn't going as well as we'd hope, if the business isn't growing as quickly as we hope, if we're not moving the flag down the beach as quickly as we would have liked, it's probably because there's some lack somewhere. So we talked about 6 lacks quite a few episodes ago. We've come back to it a couple of times and talked about particular elements, particular cells of the leadership honeycomb model and some of the lacks. Sometimes, if the business isn't going as well as we'd like, or our leadership isn't as effective as we'd like, maybe because there's a lack of clarity or vision. I'm going to go anti-clockwise today. Maybe it's because of a lack of resources. Maybe it's because of a lack of commitment. I think we just did that episode just recently. We've done a deep dive into each of these. Maybe it's because of a lack of time, or maybe resources, effort, energy. Maybe it's because of a lack of alignment, but certainly maybe it's because of lack of truth or trust. And that's really where I want us to concentrate today. I'll just say this before we continue. I know this is the model I drew, but if you want a professionalized version of this, all of the models that we have, the models that we're going to draw today, the models that we've drawn in the past, and all future models are all available for you as a complimentary digital download at www.mydailyleadership.com/podcast. What Cornelia does in her inimitable way is she takes all of the stuff that we draw and the models that we think about, and she professionalizes them, makes them look much better, right? Much cleaner. So download this model here. You see the honeycomb and the models I'm about to draw with you for a second. So we're going to do this deeper dive into lack of trust and lack of truth. And it's obvious. I think it's fairly self-obvious, fairly self-evident why trust and truth go together. What happens when we build trust and truth? We build loyalty. And of course, we want people who are loyal, engaged. We want them to stick around. We want them to have some tenure, right? When these things are lacking, the consequences are we end up micromanaging people. Nobody wants to be micromanaged, of course. We create silos, all of that not invented here syndrome, all of that sacred cow stuff, all of those silos slow organizations down. They put the organization through molasses, right? It's like moving through treacle. If you want your organization, for each individual department and the individuals in the department to collaborate, first we have to build truth and trust. So silos break down that collaboration. Lack of truth and trust leads inevitably to conflict and to low engagement. And none of those things are good. So the lack of truth and trust hurts us in many ways. So before we get into today's 2 models, I actually want to share with you an equation. What, Antonio? You mean there's an equation for trust? Yes, there is. Now, I confess I can't claim any authorship or ownership of this model I'm going to share with you, but it's an enormously powerful model. It's genius. I wish I had invented it, but there you are. Such is life. This is the trust equation. It comes from the book The Trusted Advisor, which is genius, written by David Maister. So if you want more on what I'm just about to show you, just because I'm only going to scratch the surface, but it segues beautifully into where we go next. So we've taken David's trust equation and we've blown it out into leadership. So let's first have a look at the equation, and then I'm going to draw you 2 more models, but it'll all make perfect sense in a minute, right? So let me get rid of this model and let's just quickly look at the trust equation. Okay, so you can write this down, right? And think about it. So trust whilst we're doing this, let's play a brilliant game. So here's the game we're going to play. Think about somebody in business that you trust. So someone that you have high trust with. It could be your accountant, it could be a lawyer, it could be a colleague, it could be somebody that isn't your boss, right? Just to help make it easier. So someone in the commercial world that you have high trust for, someone that you trust. Think about that person. So let's just, for the sake of argument, say Bob. Let's imagine that Bob is an accountant. Okay, so we trust Bob, our accountant. I'm going to explain why we trust Bob and how Bob can build trust and how Bob can kill trust and destroy trust. So I'm thinking of Bob, and I'm going to give Bob a trust quotient, right? I'm going to give him a number. We're going to measure Bob's trustworthiness. I know that sounds all very incredible, all very spurious, but let's go with it in terms of this model. Here's the model. So what does trust equal? Trust equals credibility. So if you want to write along, so trust equals credibility plus reliability plus intimacy. I will explain that in a second. All over. So that's the numerator, right? All over the denominator. I think that's right. Self-orientation. Let me explain that. So, I'm going to talk about Bob, right? So we'll talk about Bob, and then you'll think about the person that you're thinking about. So let's say Bob. Bob's my accountant. He's not actually. I should have put my real accountant. It doesn't matter. Okay, it's now Bob. So I trust Bob, right? So let's give Bob a score for credibility. Well, I think Bob's quite credible. Bob's been an accountant for 20 years, is well, qualified. He has some really great clients, blah, 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 blah. He knows what he's doing. He stays on top of all of the regulations and all of that kind of stuff. He's well regarded in his field. So I'm going to give Bob scores out of 5. So in terms of his credibility, I'm going to give him a 5 out of 5, right? So these are all out of 5. Okay, credibility 5. What about reliability? Well, Bob's quite reliable. Bob is true to his word. When Bob says he'll be there at 3, he's there at 3. In fact, he's there at 5 to 3. If he's there at 3, he thinks he's late, right? So Bob is, he walks his talk, right? He does what he says he's going to do, and he's doing it on time. And, his word is his bond. You can trust Bob. When Bob says he's going to do something, he's reliable and he's good to his word. So I'm going to give him a 5. A 5 for reliability. Now, intimacy. Don't misunderstand me. You'd have to read David's book perhaps for a better explanation of that. Every time I explain this to people and we write intimacy, I don't mean that Bob and I hold each other's hands, stare lovingly into each other's eyes and call each other cream bun, right? That's not what I mean by intimacy. What I mean is, how long have I known Bob, right? How much time have we spent together? How much water's under the bridge? Let's say, okay, we know each other pretty well, right? I didn't go to his wedding and he hasn't named his first child after me, so I'll give him a 3 for intimacy, right? So, okay. So 5 and 3, that's 13, okay? So the numerator, pretty sure I'm right on this, is 13. If it's the denominator, I do apologize. I went to school in England and we've only just learned decimal points, right? So 13 on the top line. What about self-orientation? Now, self-orientation is, if somebody is high in self-orientation, it means all they're interested in is themselves. So if someone's got high self-orientation, all they care about is seeing themselves do well. If somebody has low self-orientation, then they care about the other person, right? So someone high in self-orientation only cares about themselves. Someone low in self-orientation cares about the other person. So here's the thing about Bob. Bob genuinely wants to serve me well. He wants to make sure my accounts are good. He wants to try and look after me and keep my taxes as low as possible, right? avoidance rather than tax evasion. You know what I mean, right? So Bob works hard to make sure that I'm well served. So what's his self-orientation? It's pretty low. It's 1. Okay, well, what does 13 over 1 mean? It means 13. 13 over 1 is 13. Here's the thing. Imagine that was a 5, and that was a 5, and that was a 5. But Bob really kind of only cares about Bob. Now, if that were a 5, it would be 15 over 5, and that's 3. So here's the thing, we work very hard up here on our credibility, our reliability, how intimate we are with our people. Again, not holding hands and calling them cream bun, right? But the thing that grows or kills that trust is this. If somebody thinks you're only after or interested in your own self, then trust crashes. If they believe that you're interested in seeing them succeed, if you care about them, in other words, your self-orientation is low, your self-orientation comes down, then trust goes up. And we spend too long trying to convince people up here when really we should be thinking about what's down there, right? Get it? That's the principle. One of the ways that people trust us is when they believe that we care about them and their well-being. We care about seeing them succeed. Over and above ourselves, when we're trying to get our clients to coach their people, we hear this all the time. I don't know that I'm a very good coach. And I say, well, who's the best coach you've ever known? And they'll say either a coach on TV, or someone, like Pep Guardiola, pretty good, I have to say. He coaches Manchester City, who are having a hard time at the moment. But anyway, notwithstanding, they won 5 or 6 of the last premierships or Super Bowls, right? So they would either call, like a world famous coach, or maybe they'll say, well, actually, Antonio, you're the best coach I've ever known. God love you. But actually, that's not true. The best coach you have ever known was your mum or your dad, right? If they were in your life as you grew up and, they were a positive part of your life. I hope they were. Because you know what? Your mum, she helped you use a fork and read and write and walk and talk and tie your shoelaces and brush your teeth. It's not easy to learn how to tie your shoelaces, right, when you're 3. But your mum was a great coach. Why? Because she cared about you and your development more than her own personal discomfort. How do I know? She probably changed hundreds of your nappies. They weren't pleasant, right? But she was more interested in seeing your comfort than her own personal discomfort. In other words, she cared about you more than perhaps even you did when you were 2, right? So she was a great coach. She had very low self-orientation. As a consequence of that, you trusted her, right? Because she looked after you and she cared for you and all of that good stuff. Well, that doesn't stop when you're 2 or 3 or 4. That's how humans interact. So self-orientation, if your people believe you're only in this for what you can get out of it, trust is going to come down. What happens when trust comes down? Truth goes down. And that 80% of what percentage of the time your people telling you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? That comes down. Your ability to influence positively your organization comes down, right? Your ability to move the flag down the beach slows down. You get the idea. So trust and truth both start with you. Quick story. True story. I can tell this story because the guy I'm about to talk about is no longer with us, unfortunately. But one day I was sat in my office and the owner of the group of companies that I was the managing director for or CEO for had a terrible habit of just bursting into my office and sitting down and talking to me. So I was working away doing something, right? And he would just come in and sit down and start talking. He was actually one of the UK's largest pig farmers. That's not to say he was large, though he was, nor were his pigs large, but he had millions of them, right? So if you wonder where all your sausages come from, from this guy, right? I think he was a second cousin to the Queen or something. Anyway, I digress. So he would come into my office and sit down and just start talking. Anyway, this particular day he came to my office and I could instantly tell he was furious about something or other. His son still works in the business. I hope he doesn't see this. If you see this, I think you know who I mean. Love and light, love and light. Anyway, he came into my office, sat down, and he said, "Do you know where..." I'm going to change the names to protect the innocent. "Do you know where Margaret was yesterday?" And I said, "No." Margaret, I think, was our customer service manager at the time. So I said, "No. Where was she?" And he said, "She was at a funeral." I could tell he was so indignant about this whole thing. And I thought, oh, crikey, poor Margaret had to go to a funeral. And I said, "Oh, no, poor Margaret." She said, "And do you know whose funeral it was?" Now, I confess I didn't, because I didn't know that Margaret was... I wasn't in that day, right? I didn't know that Margaret had gone to this funeral. And I said, "No. Whose funeral was it?" And he said, throwing his arms in the air in disbelief, "Her uncle." I said, "Oh, no, oh, that's awful." He said, "And do you know what it says in our staff handbook about funerals?" And he got out the handbook, which was in his hand, came to the particular page, let's say page 208, and he says very clearly in our list, our staff handbook, that funerals, direct parents, right, siblings, children, and he started... And there was no uncle on the list, right? And he said, "And there's no uncle on this list." I said, "Okay, right, I see." Under the section compassionate leave, right, we can't just... I was incredibly close to my grandmother. Was my grandmother on that list? No. But you know what I'm saying, right? So, okay. So he said, "So what are you going to do about it?" He said to me. And I said, "Crikey, well, the first thing I'm going to do, I guess, is send some flowers to Margaret." And he said, No, you're missing the point. Uncle isn't on this list." I said, "Do you know what, George," that wasn't his name, "you're right." He says, "Good. So now what are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to change the company handbook." He said, "No, uncles aren't on the list." And I went, "Look, George, how close was Margaret to her uncle?" He said, "I've no idea, but it wasn't on the list, so I'm expecting you to dock her." I said, "George, I'm going to do no such thing. You know what? Let's just forget it, right?" Now, I should have known, I'll come back to my point in a second, I should have known when I first joined the organisation, and everybody says welcome, and he shook my hand, and George said, "Here's our company staff handbook." And it was like the blooming New York Yellow Pages, if there is such a thing anymore, right? If you'd have dropped it, it'd have broken your foot, right? It'd have broken your toe if it fell on your foot. It was like this, the company staff handbook. And when you read it, it'd been written by a lawyer, clearly, a bunch of lawyers. Think about that for a second. What do you imagine if that was kind of our rule book? Right? I didn't write this blooming thing. I inherited this thing. The person that wrote this thing, and that's the company staff handbook, and if uncles aren't on the list, you get docked a day's pay. How much trust do you think the people in that organisation had for their leadership? How likely are they to tell them the truth if everything comes down to, well, it says here in Law 52, subparagraph 9, section 3.8 on page 492 of the staff handbook, right? When we're getting to that point, something's wrong, right? The trust and the truth are already eroded. So what I did, I sent Margaret some flowers. I made sure that she was paid for that day. I told George that he needs to take a chill pill and maybe consider making decaf part of his life, and I threw the staff handbook away and we wrote another one, and it was maybe 4 pages long. What do you think happened then in terms of truth and trust? Well, they went up. Okay, so self-orientation is the thing that increases or decreases. If I would have said to Margaret, "Hey, we're not paying you and don't take, and here's a written warning," and all of that kind of stuff, I'm just interested in me. and not in Margaret. When I'm interested in Margaret, we do things differently, and then trust goes up. Makes sense? Good. Okay. Now, let's take these things. I'm going to draw a model. I'm going to draw two models. Let's take these three things. I'm going to draw you a quick table, and then I'm actually going to draw you a model, and then we're going to wrap for today. All right. So I want to talk about credibility, C. Reliability, R. Intimacy, we know what that is, I. And self-orientation, S-O. So I'm going to be talking about C, R, I, and S-O. You get it? Okay, time for a quick break. If you're new to the podcast, hello, welcome. Sit yourself down, get yourself a cup of tea, and have a gypsy cream. That's what they're there for. I'm Antonio Garrido. I'm the founder and president of My Daily Leadership. Serial entrepreneur, business leader, just like you. Probably not as gorgeous as you are. I've authored 3 books. I've worked with everyone from a scrappy startup to a Fortune 60, managing billions in revenue and thousands of employees. When we created this podcast, we were determined to give leaders real value and real ROI for the time, effort, and energy that they spend with us. We understand better than most, perhaps, that you are busy. So we make sure that you leave each and every episode with practical models and insight that you can apply to everyday leadership challenge right away, as soon as today. Look, if you've learned something valuable from this episode so far, and I do hope that you have, we all do, then please take a moment to like this video, be a good egg, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or maybe follow us on your preferred podcast platform. Your support genuinely helps us reach more leaders just like you. And if you're watching on YouTube, share your biggest leadership challenge in the comments. We'll either point you to a good episode, or we'll point you to a good resource, or we'll create a brand new episode just for you. I mean, you can't say fairer than that. We read every comment and reply to all of them. Really, we genuinely do. So, before we continue, remember that all of the models we discuss on the podcast, including today's trusty trust and truth models, that's not easy to say, especially if they're not your own teeth. They're available to download for free on our website. Cornelia, our delicious podcast producer, takes our drawings and turns them into sharp professional models that you can download and use when you need them. Stick them on the wall. Go to www.mydailyleadership.com/podcast to access them now. Okay, back to today's lesson. Okay, so let's have a look at this. Follow along, draw along as we develop this. Okay, so leadership type. Okay, cool. We're going to follow this table as we go down. All right, I'm hoping this is going to make sense. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, let's follow along. Let's see if we can make sense. Here we have credibility. Here we have reliability. Here we have intimacy. Here we have self-orientation. And here we have trust quotient, right? So let's imagine we have a particular leader where the credibility is high, the reliability is high, the intimacy is high, and the self-orientation is low. So our trust quotient will be high. This is ideal. This is the chap, the very chap. This is the one that we want you all to be. What happens if we have credibility high, reliability high, intimacy low, self-orientation medium? Our trust quotient, I don't know, let's say it's going to be like 50-50. What's that kind of leader? It's kind of like an unfeeling, right? Like my boss, George, a bit of a robot, right? Let's say credibility is medium, kind of at best. Reliability, medium. Intimacy, yeah, maybe high. Self-orientation, medium. Kind of like trust quotient comes down like this. Really, this is a cowardly leader. Think of the Cowardly Lion. In Wizard of Oz, think Michael Scott. You know what I mean? If you know, you know, right? Okay. What about credibility low? Reliability low, and I think this was actually my boss. Intimacy low, self-orientation high, trust quotient 0. This is a manipulator. right? If you think about the trust equation, think about where are you on the scale of credibility, reliability, intimacy. You can crash that very quickly. These take time to grow, but this, you can crash that very, very quickly. And this is the most important. Remember this box here. When Cornelia does this box, she's going to talk about this one, but this all bold and italics, maybe even a different color and a different size font. All right, good. Let me draw you one more model, and then we'll wrap for the day. Okay, so you know my favorite 4-box model. I think I'm going to be buried in a 4-box model. I'm going to ask my wife to get a coffin with 4 compartments and bury bits of me in each one. That's a bit grisly, isn't it? Right, 4-box model, right? So, truth can either be low or high. Trust, should we do it just for a bit of a jazzy difference? That can either be low or high. These things are very, very related. Let's imagine trust is high and truth is high. So what we have here is high trust, a trusted, let's say, truth teller. This is the ideal. We talked about that just before, didn't we? So I'll give you examples of those in a minute. What's that person there? This person here is honest and fair, right? And you can kind of say, you can't say fair in that, right? Honest and fair. What about trust is low, truth is high? This is the robot again, right? Just think of, well, I'm going to give you examples of all of these in a minute. This guy is blunt, force leader. Kind of does everything with a bit of a sledgehammer. You know what I mean? I'll give you some examples of that in a second. What about, oh, this guy. So this guy is honest and fair. This guy actually creates fear. Rules by fear. And you know what the problem with fear is? What does fear do to creativity and innovation and all of those good things? Well, it kills them. And what got you here isn't going to get you there. And the world moves on, and we need new solutions to, old problems, because the old problems become new and different problems, like the strain of coronavirus, right? We're constantly, problems constantly evolve and mutate. And if we don't, we're in big trouble, right? So when all of those things go down, when people stop getting, innovative, stop creating for fear of your reprisal if they make a mistake, which is the wrong kind of wrong, and all of that stuff, then the business stagnates and it's all your fault, right? So okay, what about trust low, truth low? Well, this guy is a manipulator, probably deceptive too. So this is the manipulator. What about and this is all about toxicity, right? Like, nobody wants to be that guy, right? So if you're that, stop being that guy, okay? What about trust is high, but truth is low? Well, this, come back to Michael Scott, right? This is a people pleaser. Trust is high, trust is people who doesn't ever tell them the truth, can never give them bad news. This is the avoider, the coward, right? And this guy, if you've ever seen The Office, causes stagnation and actually death by 1,000 cuts, and eventually someone from head office comes and shuts you down, right? Let's give some examples just to kind of illustrate the point. Who's this? Well, this is Jean-Luc Picard. If you don't know who Jean-Luc Picard is, you've never seen Star Trek Next Generation. I pity you and your children. It's Atticus Finch. Atticus Finch, I think it's a great example. My daughter Alice, her favourite film is To Kill a Mockingbird, or it might be a favourite book, I don't know, but that's that guy. If that's not quite your speed, You can say no better than Mustafa, can you? Lion King. I'm not going to do the song. Okay, so that's that. All right, what about this guy, the robot? If you've ever seen Dr. House, have you ever seen Dr. House? Oh no, House, or Dr. House in the program. House. This guy tells truth very high. Yeah, I'm sorry to say you'll be dead within a week, right? And he doesn't even actually say, I'm sorry to say. He just says, you're going to be dead within a week, right? Come on, right? So truth is high, but does he build trust in his people? Takes a long time. And then if that isn't quite your speed, let's have a look at, I thought about this a lot the other day. Miranda Priestley, Devil Wears Prada. All right. So, what about this guy? This is, have you ever seen Frank Underwood? Have you ever seen House of Cards? That's this guy, politician. Frank Underwood, or Emperor Palpatine. Where else could you tune in and get Jean-Luc Picard and Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars? It's like nowhere, right? Causes stagnation. We've got Michael Scott. Love him. If you're wondering how to be a good leader, just watch The Office and just go the other way, right? Just do the opposite thing. And maybe even Dumbledore, Harry Potter. Shame that he died. Spoiler alert. Dumbledore. I think it ends in an E. Who knows? Anyway, you get the idea, right? So, what I wanted to say more than anything else is, look, trust and truth starts with you. It's really important that you get and give trust and truth. You know, one of our coaches, Janice, her favorite coaching topic, she has many, she's a genius, is all about psychological safety. How good are we at creating a safe environment for people to grow and develop and try and fail, and that's okay, and recognizing that the best way to learn how to not fall off a bike is to actually fall off a bike, right? You've got to give your permission people to fail. If you're not giving your permission people to fail, trust and truth is going to crash, right? People will only speak the truth when they feel safe enough to tell the truth, and your reprisal model, you know, is fair and balanced, and you're clear and all of that kind of stuff. What are we really talking about here? Well, largely what we're talking about is emotional intelligence, right? And emotional intelligence will get you there much faster than, so EQ gets you there much faster than IQ or technical skill, which is a bit of a disappointment if you built your whole career and you built your whole ego around intelligence and experience. Okay, what do we want? We don't want a culture of compliance. We want a culture of commitment. We talked in a very recent model episode about work ethic and commitment. You cannot have commitment without trust and without truth. I think that's enough to say for now. Okay, well, that's a wrap for today's episode. But before we say ta-ta and goodbye, I'd love to hear your thoughts. After watching this episode, how would you answer this question? Are you ready? Sit down. What needs to increase and fast in your organization? A, truth. B, trust, or C, both. Leave an A or B or C in the comments, and let's see where the majority of us need to focus next. Listen, thanks for being pink and gorgeous and fluffy, for tuning in to another episode today. As always, I hope this episode offered you something valuable, even if it's just one tool or tip that improves your leadership ability by just 1%. Remember, there's enormous power in marginal gains over time. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe, or we'll send the boys round for more episodes exactly like this. And in the next episode, it's a doozy. We're covering a highly, highly, highly requested topic: growth versus fixed mindset. Now you know that. If you tune in, you've probably got a growth mindset. If you don't bother, you've probably got a fixed mindset. You might think you've got a growth mindset, but let's just say we'll put that to the test, shall we? Need I say more? I need not. I'll see you there. I'm Antonio Garrido with My Daily Leadership. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being gorgeous. Until next time, by wisdom and effort, ta-ta.